I remember very well the news coming about Fred Hampton's death. And of course, as you mentioned, his ability to unite people. Very few people are aware that Fred Hampton was the original creator of the concept of the Rainbow Coalition that a young Jesse Jackson then adopted later, because he was building unity between the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and some white radical organizations in Chicago, and he called them the Rainbow Coalition, which is what Jesse then adopted into as his main program. But he had this ability to unite all kinds of different groups, as you say, racial groups, as well as across economic lines. And in terms of the legacy of Hampton, obviously Bobby Rush, who later became a congressman in Chicago, still is a congressman. What has been in Chicago the way that the political establishment has dealt with the reality of this assassination and of the historical impact of Fred Hampton?
Well, I think for one thing it marked the independence of the black political leaders in Chicago, who had up until then had been pretty much lackeys of the mayor and the Democratic machine. And a young state senator named Harold Washington spoke out, and Danny Davis spoke out, and Jesse Jackson welcomed Bobby Rush. And all of a sudden you had an independent and much more progressive black political machine, or part of the machine that was independent. And I think that group and white liberals were given credit for eventually electing Harold Washington mayor as Chicago's first black mayor. Of course, there's also the legacy that without a young leader, I think the west side of Chicago degenerated a lot into drugs. And without leaders like Fred Hampton, I think the gangs and the drugs became much more prevalent on the west side. He was an alternative to that. He talked about serving the community, talked about breakfast programs, educating the people, community control of police. So I think that's unfortunately another legacy of Fred's murder.
And Jeff Haas, you talk in the book also about how you, a white radical raised in the South, ended up in Chicago that day as part of the People's Law Clinic there, working with the Panthers. Could you talk about your own trajectory and how you got involved in this story?
Well, I grew up in the South. I came from a progressive family, but also it was a segregated South, and I think being a white person there, we all accommodated ourselves in some way to segregation. I think it made cowards of us all. When I got to Chicago, I was influenced by what was going on nationally. Chicago was sort of the hub of all this political activity. You had the Democratic Convention there. Dr. King had marched there. You had the conspiracy trial starting. You had the National Office of SDS. All the forces were converging, and I was very much moved by the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement. So we wanted to be lawyers for the people. We wanted to be, so we started the People's Law Office in a sausage shop. And I think we started it with a sense of collectivity. So it wasn't just me. There were 4 or 5 of us who from the get-go worked together. And our mandate was to expose the murders, who the killers were of Fred Hampton. We did not know that it would take us to J. Edgar Hoover and John Mitchell and the seat of government. But of course, it turned out that way. And the more we dug and the more we uncovered, the more interested we got, and the more we realized that this was a national program. Some people have compared Hanrahan's group to sort of a local hit squad, and ordered, but was utilized by the federal government and by Hoover. And I think, unfortunately, or not surprisingly, no one has ever done a day of time for the murder of Fred Hampton, for that raid. So I think another legacy is to try to hold our government officials accountable. And interestingly enough, when the Church Committee in the 70s began to investigate COINTELPRO as well as Watergate, it was Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Ford's chief aides, who opposed any kind of exposure of this illegality or any kind of restraint on the intelligence committees.
We have to leave it there. I want to thank you very much for being with us. Jeffrey Haas, Assassination of Fred Hampton is his book, How the FBI and the Chicago Police Murdered a Black Panther. And that does it for today's program. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke and Sharifa Belkadous, Aaron Mate and Anjali Kamat, Steve Martinez and Nicole Salazar, Hani Masood, Rabbi Karen, Mike DeFilippo, Peter Curries, Miguel Aguirre, engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Nick Gilla, Hugh Grand, Peter Curries. We're going to Copenhagen. We'll be broadcasting for 2 weeks from there. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.